I'm Luca Giliberti, contributing writer for Gold Derby, and I'm joined today by Akin McKenzie, the production designer of The Woman King. So, Akin, I read that one of the biggest challenges for you and for other crew members was having to design a movie about events that took place before the actual invention of photography. So, to start things off, tell me a little bit about, how you worked around that major hurdle during your research process.
I think there's a very simple but fascinating discovery process because when you observe the past, you observe it through the lens of whoever was there transcribing it, and that is often the people with the power. So the first thing that you realize when you start to dig back through this information is who it is that's sharing it with you. The information we had to reach back into was we had illustrations from the period, all from a Western perspective, which had varying agendas, of which you can observe in those illustrations. Then we had the written word, travelers to the kingdom. We had, in starting in the 1900s, we begin to get photography from the kingdom, early 1900s, but that is post the Franco-Dahomey War. Okay. So the kingdom at that point in time is in ruins, but a lot of the patterns and traditions, they don't just get instantly wiped away from the people, so you can observe the things that you feel are true. And then you have the oral history that continues to exist in the kingdom, and people that are continuing to practice aspects of what we were investigating. So my job was not just to design sets. My job was to understand the culture and the rhythm and the spirituality of the people we were there to represent. So you're building back a whole world of which deserves discovery, attention, and respect. So then when I look back through all that, you see really negative, harmful depictions of Black Africans as subhuman in order to propagate the slave trade that was happening in Europe, to try to justify to the audience back at home why these people were not human beings, but something that could help you understand how you could dehumanize people into the point of slavery. And then that shifts, and I think that shift became important to acknowledge because as you get into colonialism, you see people interested in the resources and more interested in discussing the benevolence of the human beings because those are the people you'd be trading with. So you watch that shift. And then with the illustrations, although almost comically inaccurate at points, you start to observe patterns in them. So now if I can observe patterns in the illustration, if I can find written texts that also speak to the visuals of that, and some of these written texts are like methodically almost anthropological texts where they're just describing every detail as if the world is seeing it for the first time. And then, so if I can see the written word, observe the same patterns that I'm seeing in the illustrations, and then subsequently I can observe those patterns or a continuation of the patterns in the human beings as they exist in that space today, then that begins to give us confidence that that's something worthy of trusting. And so, although an arduous process, a super exciting process of discovery, especially when you're like, I don't think anybody's ever, besides the people that exist there today, and of course see their history with pride, love, and respect, it seems to me that the Western depiction of that space in that time was wholly negative, outside of the moments in which their agenda aligned with giving a more positive depiction. So to be able to go back into that with Gina and all these creative participants and say, I am not looking at this world from a perspective of power or righteousness or the feeling of being right. I am looking with benevolence, humility, and eagerness to understand, listen, and learn. So to sit and hear people from the kingdom today discuss their truth and to be able to participate in honoring and observing that truth was beautiful. It was really strong and poignant and powerful. And I feel like you can hear the energy that's still breathing and living in some of the walls and the worlds that we built.
That's a really, yeah, very interesting process, arduous, but as you said, sounds extremely exciting at the same time. And you mentioned, patterns that you saw in these in your material. Do you recall what some of these patterns were? Um,
Some of them are architectural patterns. So like
hmm,
the space in which Gezo sits in the parade grounds, that's a version of that I saw repeated over and over. The
okay.
architecture of those spaces, the size of those buildings, like what we built and all of the kingdom in which they interact with was done practically. So that was created. But one of the main structures, had I had my wish, would have been three times, the thatching would have been three times as high, like
Mm-hmm.
tremendously high. And I remember feeling like the illustrations were fanciful because what exists in the kingdom today, because Abomi is a World Heritage Site in
Right.
Benin, people
Mm-hmm.
should go visit if they get the opportunity. But what exists in the kingdom now, that thatching has been replaced with corrugated metals.
Mm-hmm.
The reason for the large domed tops is because you'd have fires inside, so that would dissipate some of the smoke. And they were fantastically huge. And I saw one one photograph I was able to find where that 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 I could be sure that some of these what I felt like was fanciful illustrations were actually accurate.
Mm-hmm.
There's one where there's someone in the foreground, in the background you look, and the building is so big and incredible and beautiful and magnificent. And I think we captured a lot of that in the height of and space that we created. But people should know that it was even bigger and more incredible.
Yeah.
The amount of wall covering the kingdom is 2.5 miles worth of exterior wall. 35,000 people lived within that wall. In the kingdom itself, all of the land of which Dahomey serviced and took taxes from and all that was 300, at its height was between 250 and 350,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
So this was a functional, magnificent, huge, big, complicated, troubled kingdom, not unlike European kingdoms of which have
Mm-hmm.
the same troubles and similarities. And we often watch and show a benevolent eye of which our expectation is that they are more than just the worst aspects of their culture.
Mm-hmm.
And what a breath of fresh air to be able to look at Africa in the same way and say the way that you sleep on the ground is beautiful and can be done with pride. The way you carry things, it's actually better for your spine to put it directly over your head. When you wrap a child to your back or the front of your body, they do not cry. And that is incredible. To sit in a short stool or on the ground is better for your back than a European chair. The soft bed of which we take comfort in causes atrophy in your spine. The hard surface of which both Asia and Africa and all of the world used at some point in time is how we evolved as human beings, and it's better for us. So we've lost track of some of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Turn the lens back to see it, to be educated by it, to listen to the elders that still participate in it and hear them is so important. And I think
Right.
that's my hope is that when we watch the film, we see the spectacle and the beauty of the story,
Yeah.
but then we also see the beauty of how people live and operate in that world and learn from the wisdom of some aspects of that.
Yeah. I think that's definitely what a lot of people have taken from the movie, and that's been really interesting and really nice to see in the response to it. And you already mentioned some of the main spaces of this movie, and let's talk a bit more in detail about some of them. Starting with the market area slash village that we see outside of the palace doors, which we only see very briefly at the beginning, but is so important because it's essentially the first images that we see of Dahomey. So walk me through building that area.
And my hope is that when we that if a director's cut materializes, we'll get to spend more time in that space.
Right.
But everything from the food that they're selling and how they're selling it, all of that comes from the tradition of Benin, and the things that were available to them. When you go to Mexico and you get a hibiscus drink that they call Jamaica, which is Jamaica, the real roots of that is Western Africa. When you get horchata, real roots of that is Western Africa. When you eat our yam dishes, when you eat our gumbo, all of that is Benin. So even in the food that they eat, we see not just African American history, but we see history of Western Americans' cuisine in general. How people sit and embody that space. A lot of that tradition continues to exist all over the continent of Africa. Although I want to point out, Africa is a very different place, and where we shot was South Africa, which is thousands of miles away from where we were rooted. But it was also beautiful to watch our Western African background walk into our market, be familiar with it, recognize it, sit into the space with comfort and familiarity, because the things that we were replicating were not foreign to them or their world. All of the architecture in that space is a broader language of architecture. That adobe is the building blocks of mankind, like this earthen material, which I saw 400-year-old walls, non-destructive, can go back into the earth when you're finished with it. Very different than the trauma that concrete and cement creates on the planet, especially shipping it all over the world. Again, those are things that we can learn from. And part of what I learned in that was amazing. That so in the conversation about weatherproofing it, because if it's earthen, it breaks down from water. These termite mounds came up, which we see later featured in the film. And the termites, some genius back in the day, just to digress for a second, science is the study of patterns, right? Science is the study of patterns. And we think of the scientist as a Westerner in a smock sitting in an office. You can be an elder in a village and a patient human being and look outside and watch the patterns of the world and study it in a scientific fashion and find scientific breakthroughs, of which Africa had tons and tons and tons and tons.
Of course.
But this genius saw a termite mound and saw that when it rains, it doesn't break down. And in investigating of this, I'm making this individual up because all I know is this tradition. But it was determined that's the excretion of the termites that has this waterproofing element. So as they build up their termite mound, they're also excreting, which weatherproofs it. So what I originally thought was that people were breaking down the termite mounds, and they're very hard to break. They're very, very strong. Breaking down the termite mounds and using the pieces to combine with the earthen material and the grasses to create the cob, the earthen building blocks for their walls. And that was my understanding when I made the film. But later in Benin, when recounting that story, a person in a Abomi was actually like, no, that's not it. We put the grasses on top of the termite mounds, and the termites come out and they eat the grasses. And when they eat the grasses, they excrete on the grasses. Then we use those grasses to mix with the earthen material, and we create our semi-waterproofed cob. And I love that type of information. That stuff is super exciting to, and I can't say discover, not to discover because it's known information, but to be available to hear someone share their wisdom with you is such a privilege and a pleasure.
Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing that. That was really fascinating to hear. And when it comes to the palace itself and the Agojia barracks, etc., you've spoken about in this, just now that about how the real Dahomey Palace was much bigger than what we see on screen in the movie. But I understand that you still created a massive set so that the actors could feel like they were in an actual palace. So how did you go about, creating a smaller version of it while still establishing a sense of breadth and covering all the different spaces within this palace that we see throughout this movie?
I think in both the interior and the exterior, that's palace in particular, is always an attention to depth. So in order to create this feeling of endlessness and size, the design of the Agoji barracks was made so that you're constantly seeing through colonnades into other colonnades, of which then bring you to another building. So I can shoot you this way and see 5 layers of depth. And then I can turn around the other way and see another 5 layers of depth. And then we can go profile and all that, and everything is depth, depth, depth. So even when we go into the interiors, I would I would offset different entryways into different spaces but always make them available so that same colonnade, which is the information and the building blocks of the kingdom anyway, so I'm not making that up, but the colonnades into windows, into additional spaces, the offset things, so you're feeling additional depth in every direction. That language was important to me because, I think a film like that deserves scope and bigness.
Yes.
We want it to feel big. And what many films do these days is rely on VFX for that, which we couldn't and didn't want to. So as much that could be accomplished in that regard practically was super important to us. And by and large, I haven't done a count, but the only time we see VFX extension in the kingdom are these rare moments of which you actually go above aspects of our main structure. The aerials of our kingdom that we build are huge and fantastic and big. That was impressive to me, impressive to everybody. When the actors get in there, even when the background get in there, it is like, oh, we are there. And how cool and special is that feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really like, while you do feel the size of the place, at the same time, you never feel like you're lost in it. The geography is established so well. You always have a sense of location in there, which I think is so important. And what I also like is that there is still a sort of intimate feeling there. And, when it comes to some of these smaller, more intimate spaces within the palace, like Naniska's room, what I really noticed there is that even though the decor is minimalistic, of course, there are still like some objects in the background, like on her shelf, for the lack of a better word. So I'm curious how you go about deciding what you're going to exhibit, for example, in the background in her room.
Well, I think one realization is that is kind of deep, I think, and maybe poignant in how we apply it to ourselves in Western culture, is that I believe that art at that time is an extension of spirituality and continues to be, and is not ego or the signing of a name to something, and all of it has purpose. Everything has purpose. So it is not stripping. What I believe is the concept of appropriating something, culturally appropriating something, is taking the purpose from the thing and then putting it on your wall. So when you take a purposeful mask, of which is ceremonial and is used and applied to something important, and you ignore that importance, and then you say, what a cool decoration, and you put it on your wall. That concept is not a language in the kingdom. So but with that said, craftsmanship is an art. And so we also in the West have lost our craftsmanship. There was a time in this country where every doorknob, you could buy these beautiful brass doorknobs and there'd be a signature on the back, because in the 30s, everything that was made with such attention and detail before post-World War II, where you get manufacturing and mid-century modern. Before that, you had craftsmen, individuals that created with purpose. So I think the process of how the cob is applied, when you look at Nowie's farmhouse, there are markings and details embedded into it, which we observed and recreated. All of that has both spiritual purpose, but it is an art. And how the shelves are made and molded, like we look at it, we go, that's art. But art is purpose. So watching in the film, you're seeing functionality, and yes, it is also art. And so these were lessons that I learned that's how I want to look at my life. I don't want to be like, I just made art and it's just art. Don't imagine it as purposeful. I want the application of the utilitarian aspects of creation in my life to be so thoughtful that they appear to be art. And I like that and find it romantic. So we feel that in her shelves. We feel that in above that kind of area in which her and Amenza do some ritualistic pieces, of which the root is voodoo. Also spent a lot of time in our understanding to make sure we had the rhythm of spirituality respected and understood. But above that, you feel these shapes on the wall, and they look like cob. If you look at it more closely, that is wood. That is wood supports that have been put up, raw wood with bends and movement, of which then you would then cob over it. So you feel detail and you feel texture, and it feels like decoration, but all of it is with purpose.
Yeah.
So everything we see in any of the spaces is with purpose. So every glyph that you see has a meaning. Every fabric tells a story. Every pattern has a ritual behind it. So that was a fun exploration, is how do we continue to make things visually interesting, but do not under any means rely on decoration for decoration purposes.
Exactly.
If we need more texture, let's be patient enough to observe and understand purpose behind it.
Yeah, and I think that is actually a perfect note to end on, because we're unfortunately out of time. But thank you so much for walking me through your process and for all of your insight and wisdom, honestly. It was fascinating to listen to, and congratulations on the success of this movie.
Of course, my friend, my pleasure. Thank you so much.